Good day. We live in confusing times. Men who identify as women are starting to invade women's spaces. They're competing in women's sports. They read to children in drag, and now they are moving in to women's changing rooms at swimming pools. What is going on? To try and make some sense of this, we're pleased to welcome here today Allison Pejovic. I beg your pardon, Allison. Allison Pejovic, a constitutional lawyer working with the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms. Ms. Pejovic specializes in constitutional and human rights issues. Welcome to the Western Standard, Ms. Pejovic.
Thank you very much for having me today.
You are very welcome. Ms. Pejovic, I think the issue here is the use of bathrooms, not the legitimacy of trans people themselves. Each to their own, right?
Absolutely. The issue here that we've been hearing about in the media and parents complaining is that there are some trans women entering women's bathrooms who have not completed gender reassignment surgery. So they still have male anatomy. The issue isn't whether they should be treated as women, whether they should be treated differently, but rather it's the effect on women and children when they're being exposed to trans women's male anatomy in a changing room. And these are spaces that have previously been reserved for individuals with female anatomy, and that is what women and female children expect when they go into a female changing room.
And this, of course, has been the case for thousands of years. Nobody has disputed the fact that there are men and there are women, and for some purposes, they need their own space. Now we're finding that the law doesn't see it that way. Not in Canada, anyway. What has changed?
Well, if you take a look at Section 4 of the Alberta Human Rights Act, as of 2017, I believe is when it was last amended, it now protects gender identity and gender expression. So you can't discriminate or deny a person or class of persons accommodation or access to a facility because of a variety of individual characteristics such as race, color, gender, age, and now gender identity and gender expression are included in that section of the Human Rights Act. So the human rights legislation protects the rights of trans women to access the pool. But in my professional opinion, there is a gray area here because municipal pools, in my view, could bar trans women with male genitals from using the same change room as women and their children.
So why do you say that?
Yeah, I say that because of Section 11 of the Alberta Human Rights Act. And that provides a defense clause to a potential claim for discrimination. If a trans woman with male genitals complained, I can't access the women's changing room, that's discriminatory. Well, the municipality, such as the City of Calgary, could have an argument using Section 11 of the Alberta Human Rights Act, which basically says that there hasn't been a contravention of the Act if there are reasonable and justifiable circumstances. And in my legal opinion, it is reasonable and justifiable to exclude anyone with male genitals from changing in a space that has historically been only for women to protect the comfort and emotional and mental well-being of vulnerable female children and women. And some women are victims of sexual assault, so seeing male anatomy can be triggering for them. So this is a live issue, but I do believe that there is room in the Alberta human rights legislation for city pools to say, no, sorry, we're recognizing that you are entitled to your own space to change. But unfortunately, if you haven't physically transitioned into that you don't have female anatomy at the moment, you're not allowed to change in that space.
You know, Ms. Pejovic, speaking as an unreconstructed product of the 19th century, it does seem to me to be a peculiar thing that we should even be having this discussion. I'm looking at the legislation that you have provided here, and To me, no wonder people are confused about this. Everything we thought we knew 6 months ago, a few years ago, has been turned upside down. So let me ask you, what happened? Why are we having to deal with this?
Well, over the years, there has been an evolution in our society. Society is constantly progressing, and we've progressed to the point where there is continuing and ongoing and evolving recognition for marginalized groups in society.
I guess that's a good thing.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the law has kept up with that. The Supreme Court of Canada, continues to be open to recognizing analogous grounds of discrimination. And so, in recent times, we've recognized as a society that the trans people, trans individuals are groups that are being discriminated against. And so the law has responded, the courts have responded, and we're seeing greater protections for that group, just as we have for other groups in the past, such as different racial minorities, people with disabilities, and now it's the trans community.
I see. I hear what you say, but I also have the conversations of people who read what we put out in the Western Standard, and I have to ask you this in a very direct way. Does the law actually allow trans people who are not fully transgendered to use washrooms of the sex they identify with? People just can't wrap their heads around that. It just seems like the decent thing to do is not to do that. In other words, a biological male gets undressed in a woman's changing room. Only a few years ago, that was unthinkable. And is it really legal now?
As I mentioned earlier, it's that human rights legislation, and I believe from reading an article on from your news organization that a parent complained about their child witnessing a individual with male anatomy walking around the women's changing room, and I read that the city of Calgary responded and said, "Well, we can't do anything because there's human rights legislation protecting that person and giving that person the right to change in that bathroom." But as I've said, there is a defense clause. And so if a complaint was made to the city or another municipality about this, I do believe there is an argument that a human rights tribunal could consider, and I think it would be successful, that it is reasonable and justifiable to exclude somebody with male genitals from using the change room to protect the most vulnerable in our society, who are our children.
So the common sense solution seems, well, just use one of the washroom stalls, or use, I guess most facilities these days have a family changing room, a private space, so the trans person could use one of those private spaces and not intrude on the experience of the changing room that anybody else has. Is that a solution?
Absolutely. I think that there has to be a safe space for vulnerable female children and women who want to go and access these public facilities and are not expecting to see somebody with male anatomy. And it's not about hating a trans person whatsoever. You can identify as a female, but if you still have male anatomy, that could have an effect. And we know it has an effect on some vulnerable people. We know that there was a teenage girl recently who complained. I read about it on your news organization that she was.
Glad you're reading the Western Standard.
That's right. She was traumatized when she was changing in a Calgary changing room at a pool, and there was a trans woman walking around fully nude, and she was traumatized by that. So this is definitely an issue that needs to be resolved. And unfortunately, where the law has done a good job of protecting minorities, such as trans people, it has not taken into account the effect on vulnerable citizens, such as young female children or young women in these facilities. And so there's competing interests
here.
They
have rights too, don't they?
Absolutely. There's competing rights, and the law is only at the moment protecting the rights of trans people.
So This is the theoretical background. But here's the confusion that I hear over the phone, I get in the letter to the editors. Let's say you're a mother who encounters this situation. You're in the changing room, you have your daughter with you, and there's a person in there with a male anatomy walking around, at any rate, undressing. It's beyond awkward. So here's the confusion. You ask the person to leave, but that person refuses. Say, I'm trans, I have a legal right to be here. We've already established that there is a legal right. What can you do? What are your options? Can you call the police? Apparently there's no crime being committed.
Well, I know, that there have been calls to police about this happening in Calgary. And to my knowledge, the police have not charged anybody right now. And if you look at the offense of indecent exposure, which you might think that this might fall into that category, indecent exposure requires exposing oneself for a sexual purpose, and merely changing in a changing room that you are otherwise lawfully allowed to access, in my view, would not be construed as being an act for a sexual purpose. So, unless somebody, whether it was someone of any sexual orientation, was doing something lewd in a changing room, you really don't violate that provision here. And my guess is that's why the police haven't made any charges yet, because if you're just changing in a changing room and you're allowed to be there, that doesn't breach the provisions of the criminal code. No. But I just want to reference a 2019 case out of BC where a trans woman named Jessica Yaniv made human rights complaints against various owners of waxing salons, because Yaniv wanted the owners of the salons to wax her male body parts, and the women of multiple salons refused to do so. And the BC Human Rights Tribunal dismissed Yaniv's complaints against the salons and the salon owners, and found, and I quote, "A scrotum is different than a vulva, regardless of the gender of the person it is attached to." The tribunal also took into account the testimonies of various salon owners that they did not feel comfortable waxing Yaniv's male anatomy, and also found that there's an element of consent. There would have to be consent by the owners to wax anatomy that is different from what they advertise for, which is female anatomy. So again, I want to stress here, it's very important that we're not talking about hating on anybody. What we're talking about is the fact that unless there has been a physical gender reassignment surgery, someone in the female changing room, young women and children, are going to see male anatomy in these situations. And they don't understand that this trans woman identifies as female. All they know is what they see. And that is having an effect on women and children, because they've been making complaints, and we hear about that kind of thing through the work that we do. So this is an issue, and there are conflicting rights here, and it's a very significant problem.
Do you take some encouragement for positive change from the outcome of the Yaniv case?
Well, yes. I mean, it's a recognition that there has to be a line drawn, and we have to respect the rights of minorities, including trans women, absolutely. But there are differences in anatomy, unless someone has had surgery that the tribunal has recognized, and that is a factor. And there's a reason, and the tribunal found this is a reasonable reason for refusing that service, is that the anatomy is different. And so I can see that being somewhat analogous to a situation like this if it ever got into a tribunal complaint situation, or if it ever got to court, because there are competing rights here. And unfortunately, the rights of children are not being looked after at this time.
So, yes, what I'm hearing you saying is if you're actually in this situation, there's not an awful lot you can do. But if you want to work for change, what are your options?
Well, what I would tell parents at this point, I would tell them about the human rights legislation, which protects trans women's rights to access that changing room. But, parents are free to make a complaint to the city of Calgary or whatever municipality they live in. If enough people come together and explain, I don't know that it needs to be explained, but write a letter, make a phone call, talk to your MLA, talk to the city about how this is affecting their children, how this is affecting them. They want to have a space where they can change, where they're not going to be witnessing and exposed to anatomy of a male. And that unfortunately, we're faced with these conflicts.
So the city of Calgary owns the swimming pools and the changing rooms that go with them. At the provincial level, is there the province owns the Alberta Human Rights Act? Is there a way of changing that?
Absolutely, it could be amended, and what I would like to see, just so that everybody's rights are respected, is the recognizing that there are protections for gender expression and gender identity, but also including a provision in there that there have to be safe spaces for women and children to change in these kind of situations where they are changing with other people with the same anatomy, and they're not going to be exposed to male anatomy. And that is something that is absent in the law right now, and it's something that we'd very much like to see changed.
Ms. Pejovic, I can't believe I'm saying this, but what about a human rights challenge?
Well, yeah, I mean,
Did it go anywhere?
I'm not sure. The problem with the human rights legislation, and it wasn't drafted with these situations in mind years ago. What it does is it protects someone from being denied access to a service. So in this situation, a mother who wants to protect her child is not being denied access to a female changing room. And the law right now doesn't protect her right to be in there and exclude somebody with male anatomy. It just doesn't cover that situation. So I think that a case could be made that she and her child are being discriminated against on the basis of sex. I don't know what the Human Rights Tribunal will do with that. That is a new situation. But I'm not saying there's no chance, but I'm not sure how strong of a case it would be. But it'd be worth looking into. And also, there could be a charter right to, under Section 7, this situation could engage Section 7, which is a right to security of the person. And a parent could argue that my child's security of the person right is being infringed by being exposed in this government facility to someone who has male anatomy, and they want to protect that child from that. So, I'm not sure how strong that would be, but it's definitely worth looking into.
Mm-hmm. Well, for sure. I'd be a brave guy if I tried to outguess what a Human Rights Commission would do on any given issue, but I'm interested to hear you say there could even be an argument there that would be listened to. So we looked at the law side of this. We've looked at the situation at the swimming pool. There's simply the matter of protesting. This is wrong, you say. This shouldn't be going on. And yet we have a bylaw, apparently, which if you do that, you're considered hateful. So can you talk to us? What advice do you have for people who just plain want to have their say on this? Protest.
Well, peaceful protest is protected by the Canadian Constitution, specifically in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The Canadian Constitution is the highest law in the land. And in my view, the Calgary bylaw, which looking to rebrand freedom of expression as harassment, or freedom of speech as harassment. In my view, that's unconstitutional and a violation of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, because for as long as the Charter has been around, people are allowed to stand in public places holding signs, chanting, making themselves heard. Protests are a part of a stable and functioning democracy. What you can't do is be hateful with your speech, and that is already a criminal code offense. So what it looks like the City of Calgary is trying to do here is to, make something, penalize protesters when the criminal code already protects against hate speech. So in our view, the City of Calgary doesn't have the jurisdiction to do that. That is something that the federal government has already done. And it's a high bar to inciting hatred with speech. And the criminal code basically says you cannot incite hatred, which could lead to violence against a specific group. And so I would say, as long as you're, protesting respectfully in every case against whatever you want to say about anything in society, you have to be respectful, and you can't make comments that could incite other people to violence.
That actually puts us in mind of an incident recently where somebody actually went into a private event, and I think it was a drag queen story hour. I'm pretty sure that's what it was, at a public library. Is that acceptable?
Well, again,
it's a private event.
If it's a private event, somebody can be charged with trespassing. If you stay in a public space, you are absolutely legally entitled to protest. That right is, as I've said, is protected by the Constitution, and no bylaw can override that, as long as you're not inciting violence through hate speech.
I see. Okay. So then really, we have to, is it going to take a challenge to that city bylaw, do you think?
Yes. I mean, you can be charged you can be given a ticket under this bylaw, but in my view, that bylaw will not survive a constitutional challenge. So I hope to see that happen in the future, because we need to protect the freedom of expression and freedom of speech in Canada. It's very important.
Okay. So what we have here is a complex situation, and really we're looking for a way that people of goodwill, and that may not include everybody, but people who actually want to get along together can get along together. What's the path forward for people who just want to make this work?
Well, I would suggest, in order to respect and protect the rights of everyone here, is that trans women are not forced to change in the male bathroom, but that they be given their own private space to change, to protect the interests and rights of vulnerable female children and women, so that they can also have a space where they're not being exposed to male anatomy in a space that they previously felt safe. So,
can we go on like this?
Absolutely not. I fear, just from reading the stories and the comments and hearing from parents, some parents are very angry and very protective of their children. Understandably, it doesn't matter to them how somebody identifies when what they're looking at is what you can see in a changing room. So I see this as a real problem, because we certainly don't want any hatred towards the trans community. So the best result, in my view, is to have a separate space for that trans person who has not undergone the gender reassignment surgery to change, so that there's no conflict with anyone. And as I've said before repeatedly, we have to remember the most vulnerable group in our society is children. And specifically in this particular circumstance, it's young female children, and their interest must be protected.
Certainly you can see the possibility of conflict in this situation.
Yes. I'm afraid of what might happen if this doesn't get resolved.
Okay. So there it is, ladies and gentlemen. The law has been changed. This does not make the law right. But laws can be changed. Practices can be changed. And some need to be. And there is a way to do it. Parents and children have rights. And in our hurry to accommodate a minority, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but nevertheless, in our haste to accommodate a minority, we have an obligation, in my view, not to trample upon the rights of a majority. People who care about this need to go to work on it, and there's a right way to do it. Ms. Pejovic, all your career, and I am aware of some of it, all your career you have been a fighter for what's right. Thank you for being here today and giving us your wisdom. God bless you.
Thank you, Mr. Hannaford, for having me.
It's been a pleasure. For the Western Standard, I'm Nigel Hannaford.
The current Lethbridge feed grain prices are as follows. Cash barley remains at $4.17. Feed wheat is unchanged at $4.30, while corn is sideways at $4.24. Over to the milling wheat markets, May Minneapolis futures added 3.5 cents at $8.27 per bushel, with local hard red spring bid for April movement at $10.85 per bushel delivered. Looking at the oil seeds, nearby canola futures tanked $24.80 at $767.50 per ton, with delivered values for April movement at $16.95 per bushel. In the pulse markets, nearby red lentils are unchanged at 33 cents a pound, and yellow peas are trading at $12.50 per bushel. And in the cattle markets, April live cattle dipped 30 cents at $164.50 per hundredweight. For more information on pricing and picked up on-farm options, give me a call at 403-394-1711. I'm Vera Buziak at Marketplace Commodities, accurate real-time marketing information and pricing options.
Canadian Shooting Sports Association. Without the CSSA, our gun rights would have been taken long ago. These guys are on the front lines helping to draft smart and intelligent firearms regulations and legislation in Canada, and more importantly, educating the public about how we keep guns out of the hands of the wrong people. To become a member, it's absolutely worth every penny. You can become a Western Standard member for just $10 a month or $99 a year for unlimited